From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Calum, MacDonald. Today, we're heading to the front line in Ukraine.
At some point you feel like you're in a Second World War movie, and other times you're in a science fiction movie.
Our guide is Maxim Tucker, the Times Ukraine correspondent. He's just returned from a unit testing new ways to respond to Russia's latest weapon of choice, the Shahid suicide drone. Hundreds are being launched every night at Ukrainian cities. The answer, Ukraine hopes, lies in a mobile office.
We were in a control cabin of a Soviet vehicle which had got all these wires plugged into it, banks of screens inside the cabin, only 6 soldiers there, concealed in a tree line. So this Soviet vehicle is hidden under branches. There are bunkers dug into the trench line around it, which the men can take cover in if they're being bombed by Russian airplanes, which we came quite close to. And you can see on their radar screens all of the aerial activity. So we could see Shahed drones attacking Odessa from Crimea. We could see Russian jets incoming on our position. Luckily, they veered off and bombed another set of the front line.
The drone war is intensifying. Russia has the momentum. And this week, President Trump is sending his special envoy Steve Witkoff to Russia, threatening sanctions ahead of the latest deadline for Putin to sign a ceasefire. But behind all of that, there's another crisis rumbling in Ukraine, a political one which may change the support Volodymyr Zelensky's government receives abroad. Ukraine's long battle with corruption. The story today, Zelensky's new battle on the home front.
I'm Maxim Tucker, Ukraine correspondent for The Times, and I've just come back from the country where I spent 2 weeks in Kyiv and on the front lines in Ukraine. So they're pioneering a very exciting development in anti-drone warfare, these interceptor drones, which are used to shoot down President Putin's preferred weapon of choice at the moment, the Shahed drone, which is an Iranian-designed drone that is now attacking Ukrainian cities and overwhelming Ukraine's air defenses. Now, Ukraine has been relying on US and European supplied missiles, which are quite expensive to shoot those down, and they need a cheaper solution, one that can be mass produced more easily. And these interceptor drones look like they may be a solution to that. So this crew have been testing this for a US enterprise, a US arms enterprise, which has a major backer that can't be disclosed at the moment. And they've been enjoying some success. So in the past month and a half, they shot down 60 to 70 of these Shahed drones in their small area of operation. And they hope that this battlefield test will allow the US arms enterprise to scale up production and help save Ukrainian cities from the terror that's being inflicted on them at the moment.
To what extent does this feel like a real change in the nature of this conflict?
So the conflict has been moving more and more towards drone warfare. So the infantry battles, the artillery duels, they still happen from time to time, but there is a huge grey zone now between the two sides. Drones on both sides can reach 20 kilometers now, the first-person view drones. And they saturate the front lines, and they target individual soldiers in the trenches. And then we have these long-range drones, the Shahed, and Ukraine also has these Luti drones, which are targeting now Moscow and other cities which are producing oil refineries, perhaps, or tech that is used to develop the drones. And that is really the nature of this war, is who can get the upper hand by having a longer-range drone capacity and who can produce more of them. And Russia has recently showcased this Alabuga production facility, which it wants to produce up to 5,000 drones a day, which will be an incredible amount to be sending over to Ukraine.
Is it possible to say who might be winning, who is perhaps got momentum, who is gaining the upper hand?
So unfortunately, Russia has the momentum now. It's pushing forward around the cities of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, and Ukraine is really doing all it can to stop losing ground in this war. Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka are both nearly surrounded. And Ukraine will now face a difficult decision about whether to withdraw the troops that are garrisoning those towns and hand Putin some kind of symbolic victory. In other areas of the front, it's happening differently. So the area of the front where we were at is called an area called Izium, and it's manned by the 3rd Army Corps. This is a new corps which is formed with the basis of it, the 3rd Assault Brigade, which is a kind of a feared brigade. The Russians are very worried by it, staffed by very patriotic, mostly young men who are really dedicated to the fight. They have opened up to Western technology, so they're allowing Western arms firms like this startup to test on the battlefield in the hope that they can be ahead of the curve when it comes to a technological solution to the war. And they are holding their ground, and they're inflicting terrible casualties on the Russians. And the Russians are also suffering terrible casualties in Donbass as they push forward. But it just doesn't seem that those, we once thought that given what happened when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, you would see huge casualties in Ukraine and then the Russians will pull back. But Putin's regime is just something entirely different. It just doesn't care how many Russian soldiers it loses.
In terms of, I suppose, the wider strategy then, Maxim, shall we consider headlines this past few days about a corruption scandal involving drones? I think, first of all on this, just give us the context, because there's some important distinctions that we need to make here.
Right, so this is not about the drones that we went to witness, the interceptor drones. This is another drone procurement scandal. It's an active investigation. 4 arrests were announced by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, and presumably they will be investigated and then the people will be brought to court. We know from President Zelensky, who announced that an MP from his party had also been arrested as part of this anti-corruption investigation, and he has condemned that. It's interesting, of course, that Zelensky himself wants to announce further details of this. We understand the scheme included 30% kickback, so 30% of the cost of the contract was being given to officials who passed the contract through procurement channels. These bodies that investigate corruption are supposed to be independent of the president's office. And there was a big scandal the previous week when President Zelensky tried to pass a law, or he did pass a law that undermined the independence of these bodies.
We know Ukraine's parliament today passed legislation that would tighten oversight of 2 key anti-corruption agencies.
They've been brought under the control of the Prosecutor General, who answers to the President.
Critics of the new law say it weakens the independence of Ukraine's anti-corruption bodies.
This bill effectively undid more than a decade's worth of anti-corruption efforts.
And there were protests and there were international condemnation of that move.
They are the biggest anti-government protests that we've seen since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion.
And he's had to roll it back now. So it's an interesting time for Ukraine, where corruption is now at the forefront of the news, having been suppressed for a long time because so many journalists in Ukraine, so many MPs, so many people were keen to support the war effort and didn't want to highlight anything that might jeopardize international support for it.
There's so much in there to consider, Maxim. Let's go through some of the issues. First of all, I think this idea that corruption has been, well, I don't know, would you say rife or certainly obvious, even if it has gone somewhat under the radar, owing to this idea of a bigger sense of loyalty and purpose given the war that Ukraine is fighting? How extensive has corruption been?
Well, I was in Ukraine during the time of the pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. Corruption then was absolutely endemic. It was rife. It was everywhere. And a lot has been done since the Revolution of Dignity with Western support to curtail corruption and to stamp out petty corruption. There are still numerous reports of corruption at a higher level, but those are often investigated. There are often arrests. There are very few successful prosecutions still, which is unfortunate, but there are arrests and there are people removed from office as a result of it. And that signals that there is a functioning anti-corruption body that has been supported for a long time by the West. So that is actually good news, I think, for Ukraine. I mean, the fact that there can still be, at this time of war, contracts which envisage a 30% kickback to officials that pass it is really bad news, obviously, because the way that Ukraine could win this war against a big kind of mafia, corrupt state like Russia is by making sure that its money is better spent, that it is finding the best drones and is able to produce more of them per dollar than the Russians can. So it is a huge national security issue, and Ukraine really needs to tackle it. And I think the Zelensky administration has had a quite old-fashioned view of corruption in that he himself has had no credible allegations of corruption against him. But I think the people in his circle seem to think that it is okay to use corruption as a means to control subordinates. And obviously all of this boiled over with trying to pass that law and spurring protests on the streets as a result.
Tell us about the protests. How big were they? How long did they last? What was the nature of them?
So the protest was very interesting. There were thousands of people taking to the streets of Kyiv. They really packed the square that they had designated for the protests as tightly as possible. Most of Ukraine's major cities, they had some form of protest there as well. And what was very interesting was a lot of these were young people. There were some soldiers among them. And it was really the kind of the generation of people that really look towards the EU as their future. And they are aware, very painfully aware, given what happened in previous administrations, that any move to kind of protect corruption in Ukraine is anathema for Ukraine's European dream, its idea that it wants to join the European Union. Ukraine's civil society joined the condemnation. International partners were very quick to condemn it. And I think it really showed the resolve of Ukraine's democratic society to make sure they stay that way, to make sure they stay democratic, to make sure their anti-corruption bodies stay independent, and to resist an authoritarian tendency which is perhaps understandable in wartime when you have difficult decisions to make, when you have to make decisions very quickly, when you don't want to be having to win over public opinion in order to do things. But Ukraine has made clear to Zelensky, I think, that they know what they're fighting for, and they're fighting for something that is to be different from Russia. They don't want to just become another Russia fighting with Russia.
I think what you say there about almost the inevitability of corruption during these times of crisis, to an extent can be overlooked. That is just what happens. Perhaps there is a level to which that just occurs in any of crisis moments such as this. But are we saying that actually Ukraine is at something of a tipping point where this needs to be gripped now?
I think so. We had a very positive move by Zelensky in appointing Yulia Sviridenko as prime minister and two reform-minded deputies, and they were regarded as clean politicians. So it was a really big challenge for them to come into office and have to deal with this scandal within days. Her government now, I think, is going to be tested, Yulia Sviridenko as prime minister. She is someone who has been loyal to Andriy Yermak, President Zelensky's powerful chief of staff, but whether she now has an opportunity to become a little bit more independent, to push through some reforms, that could be something that's good for Ukraine. It's good for Ukrainian arms procurement and open it up to people that don't necessarily operate in the old ways of having to pay kickbacks in order to get your product through. So I think Ukraine did reach a tipping point. If Zelensky had been able to pass that law unopposed, you would have the president's office controlling everything, essentially. And he would have been in charge of the anti-corruption organizations. And if any anti-corruption investigation was coming close to him or his circle, or he felt it wasn't the right political timing for it, he could have taken control of that. And that would have been a very bad move for Ukraine. However, because Ukrainian civil society came out and protested, I think Zelensky now has a very clear message that it will not be tolerated in Ukraine, and he has to tread carefully going forward. So I think it's still at a tipping point, and probably will be for the foreseeable future, where Zelensky might be concerned about damage to his reputation or damage to the country's reputation and trying to suppress anti-corruption investigations, but also painfully aware that doing that has an extreme political cost, not only domestically, but also internationally. And we're at a time when Ukraine is so dependent on its international partners, that's really important. I mean, I remember I interviewed the Prime Minister, Yulia Sviridenko, and she was telling me that all of Ukraine's domestic welfare budget was being funded by European and US partners. Most of Ukraine's tax dollars are going towards arms procurement. So the country is entirely dependent on international support at the moment. And if at any moment its international partners say, we're not funding you because we have these corruption concerns, Ukraine will essentially be cast adrift, and Zelensky cannot afford that.
The other part of that you mentioned there is the intrinsic link between European ambitions, or EU ambitions of Ukraine, and I suppose the conditions that the European Union is placing on Ukraine in order to make progress in that way. So the tightening up, the kind of rules, the restrictions coming from the EU is a huge part of this too.
Absolutely. The EU is really dedicated to anti-corruption reforms. And I think the EU has been burned before by taking in countries that perhaps weren't quite ready. I mean, look at the situation in Hungary now. You've had big anti-corruption problems in Bulgaria and Romania as well. So that will be a really important measure of Ukraine's progress towards the EU. And that's something that the whole of Ukrainian society is now really invested in. You know, they see that there is no future in any kind of Russia-aligned bloc. So the future is with Europe, and Ukrainians are determined to make sure that their government adheres to the promises that it's made when it signed the EU Association Agreement. And it's going to be, I think, a tug of war between those that have powerful vested interests and seek to make a lot of money from the contracts that could be handed out during war, and Ukraine's civil society, which is also being undermined by, a lot of people being drafted, a lot of people being mobilized. Civil society activists in general signed up as patriots to fight at the beginning of the war. A lot of them have been killed. So Ukraine's future is really hanging in the balance now between those that remain and the people who just want to make money from the situation that Ukraine is in.
Maxim, one of the other claims in all of this, of course, made by President Zelensky, who has said that agencies, particularly the ones we've been talking about today, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialised Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, that these needed to be cleared of Russian influence. Is there evidence of Russian influence at the heart of some of Ukraine's top institutions?
Well, they did release some evidence of wiretaps of a National Anti-Corruption Bureau detective, which seemed to suggest that there may be Russian influence involved. But that was not nearly enough to justify taking the entire body under presidential control.
Maxim, you've been telling us about President Zelensky's recent attempt to bring the country's anti-corruption bodies under the oversight of this Prosecutor General of Ukraine. We've mentioned the huge anti-government protests. Are these sorts of movements, the protests, are they resonating with Zelensky? How in touch does he seem to be with the people?
They do resonate with Zelensky, particularly because they were right outside his office. They were very noisy. That was the idea of the location. It was as close as they could get to the presidential office. And I think also these are exactly the kind of people that Zelensky once identified himself. This was a kind of young, artsy, hipstery Kyiv scene. There were lots of people very flamboyantly dressed. They were excited to be there. It was the kind of people that Zelensky, when he was in his showbiz career, would have associated with. So I think he is sensitive to it. He's still a politician that, above all, wants to be liked. And I think, he still has a view that at some point there will be elections and he may want to seek a second term in office. And I think that he is considering all of those things when he looks at the protests, when he looks at the critical news coverage. But I think if it hadn't been for the overwhelming international pressure to change tack on this, I'm not sure that he would have listened only to domestic criticism.
With that in mind, give us a sense of Zelensky's reputation, insofar as it can be measured, both, I think, in the kind of political world, among his politicians, his party, etc., and among the public.
Well, interestingly, he has enjoyed an overwhelming majority since 2019, which obviously hasn't been challenged because there are no elections in Ukraine at the moment. But a lot of MPs have spoken out. Well, they've spoken privately mostly, but they have expressed annoyance at this vote having been rushed through and their own reputations having been tarnished by association with this vote. Domestically, a lot of people had been already talking about the increasing power of Andriy Yermak, President Zelensky's chief of staff, and the fact that there is not much room for dissenting voices or people with different opinions, and the removal from office of lots of well-respected ministers whose profile had got a bit too big, maybe considered a rival for Zelensky, and, attempts to, the successful moving out of General Zaluzhny was also an unpopular decision. I think that was when we saw people criticizing Zelensky for assuming too much power and wanting people who were basically sycophants to be around him. So I think, that is something that is going to continue to be an issue for Zelensky now, domestically. And then internationally, I think that Zelensky for a long time had enjoyed this reputation, a well-earned reputation, I would say, of being a war hero who stuck around when all the odds were against him. But having this very odd move against the independence of anti-corruption bodies does send a worrying signal to international partners. It isn't something that they can ignore. And I think, the publicity around it it surprised a lot of people who see Zelensky only as a war hero to hear that there is a darker side to his government. And that has damaged his reputation, especially at a time when he needs to win over a very skeptical US administration who had already been highlighting corruption as a concern and a reason not to support Ukraine. It is damaging for him.
Maxim, as we consider President Zelensky's actions in combating corruption at the heart of government, at the heart of this war effort, can you assess for us whether he may have misstepped? Is this the beginning of the end for him?
It's definitely a misstep. It's been made clear to him by his international partners, by Ukrainian civil society, and by Ukrainian protesters that is not acceptable in today's Ukraine. And they have made clear that they are willing to go out on the streets and challenge any future missteps like that. I do not think it is the beginning of the end for him, because we won't have elections in wartime Ukraine. It's just impossible for them to take place anytime soon. So he is set to enjoy his majority for a considerable period of time. I think he will face more difficulties now because international partners will consider him with a greater degree of skepticism.
What then of the world leader, and other world leaders, and their interpretation of Zelensky? We've touched on, I suppose, the pressure that Zelensky could face, particularly from President Trump, if the issue of corruption isn't dealt with, if he doesn't get a grip in it. It can be an excuse for somebody like President Trump to sidestep supporting Ukraine. Trump is running the table. Is that fair, Maxim? How would you assess Trump's involvement right now?
Yes, so the US is still absolutely key to supporting Ukraine's domestic budget. It's still key to supporting Ukraine in terms of weapons and to kind of encouraging other Western partners to make weapons available. So they definitely still rely on US support. They've had some good noises from the Trump administration. Interestingly, Trump himself doesn't seem particularly concerned by claims of corruption. So perhaps that is not an issue that is particularly important for him, as long as the personal relationship with Zelensky is good. And Zelensky has been doing everything that Trump wants of him lately, and that is what Trump likes to see. So you have, on the one hand, Zelensky doing what he's told, and on the other hand, Putin not doing what he's told. And I think that will encourage Trump to take a more positive view of Zelensky.
That brings us then to the latest of Trump's rather flexible deadlines that he places on Putin from time to time. The 8th of August is when his next deadline expires, and this is really for Putin to sign up to peace. As part of this, we understand that Steve Witkoff will actually be sent to Russia. He is the special envoy from the Trump administration, even in the course of the next few days, Maxim. What is your assessment of this latest deadline? Putin seems to shrug them off as they come and go.
Yes, I don't believe that Putin will care about any deadlines imposed on him. He may care when he sees what kind of sanctions are imposed on him and how damaging they are to the Russian economy, and if they are followed up by things that could be more painful for his regime. He probably sees at this stage Trump's different deadlines, different threats that haven't come to any meaningful action as a bluff, and he's definitely prepared to call a bluff before he changes policy. And I think also for Putin, he sees Ukraine's independence as an existential crisis. If there can be this kind of successful democratic neighbor next door to Russia, that Russians will think, well, why can't we have the same kind of democratic state and freedoms that Ukraine has? Why do we have to exist in this corrupt system with a complete vertical power structure? So I think he considers that as the biggest danger to him. Now, Donald Trump Is he serious this time, or it's anyone's guess, really, isn't it? He's sending Steve Witkoff to Russia. Now, Steve Witkoff has made some astonishing pro-Putin statements and astonishing statements, essentially justifying Russia's ambitions in Ukraine.
I think the largest issue in that conflict are these so-called four regions: Donbass,
Yes.
Crimea, the names Lugansk, and there's two others. They're Russian-speaking.
Yep.
There have been referendums where the overwhelming majority of the people have indicated that they want to be under Russian rule.
Yes.
I think that's the key issue in the conflict.
Whether we will see a completely dramatic shift in the Witkoff-Putin relationship, which has been very chummy and very friendly so far, will be very interesting. I can't imagine that Witkoff will suddenly row back on the attitude that he's taken to date, but he must bear in mind that there is this Trump deadline looming and he has to do something to force it to happen. It's anyone's guess how this will unfold in the next week. It's going to be very interesting to watch.
That was Maxim Tucker, Ukraine correspondent for The Times. You can read his dispatches from the front line at thetimes.com with your digital subscription. The producer was Kate Lamble. The executive producer was Edward Drummond. Sound design was by Tom Birchall, and theme composition was by Mau Lassetto. If you can, please leave us a review. It'll help others to find us. See you again soon.